Well, thank you, Peter. And Peter's got so much to tell us on AA that Peter, we're going to give the first half of his talk.
As I explained to John, that you don't want to listen to my voice for too long. To get the whole story over in a reasonable time is not possible, so I'll be sort of dealing with his earlier life today, and then next time from when he bought Kingwill's Place onwards.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Then will you go ahead?
As John has said, I've been asked to talk to you this morning about the life of my grandfather, Arthur Alfred Kingwill. He was known to everybody as AAK. And he of course had a long history here in Grafenet. He was a very well-known figure. His memoirs are contained in a little booklet with the title of A Karoo Farmer Looks Back. Now, that was compiled by Jerry Riley, who was a journalist married to Pamela Kingwill, one of AAK's granddaughters. And because he'd had such an interesting life, it was felt that it should be recorded, and so Jerry Riley then had interviews with AAK. So the information comes from that little booklet. It's, in other words, what he remembered about his life. Now, to bring his life into perspective, I'd like to take a step back to 1849, when John and Martha Kingwill decided to emigrate to South Africa. So they got on board a ship. They lived in Derbyshire in England. They boarded a sailing ship and set out with their destination being Port Elizabeth in South Africa. Now in those days with the sailing ship, the journey took 6 months. Now, if you can sort of imagine spending 6 months on a sailing ship. So they boarded with their 4 children at that stage, but another baby was born on board ship. So when they landed, they had 5 children. Now when they got to Port Elizabeth after this very long sea journey, there was at that stage no harbour at Port Elizabeth. So the ship had to drop anchor some way off the beach where there was deep enough water. And the passengers were then lowered in baskets off the ship onto rowing boats to row them up to the shore. But even the rowing boats couldn't get right onto the sand of the beach. The last little distance to the breakers, the women and children had to be carried. And so when Martha was told that she had to hand over her newborn baby to a black man to carry through the surf onto the beach, she became hysterical because she'd never seen a black man. I don't know whether she perhaps thought that he wanted to eat her baby, but anyway, it apparently caused quite a scene. And eventually her husband John was able to calm her down and persuade her that she must please hand the baby to this black man. And so they landed on the beach in Port Elizabeth, which at that time they say was a village of about a dozen or so houses. They managed to acquire a piece of land where Utenaid is today. And they started growing vegetables, and they set up a small shop selling vegetables. Unfortunately, the father, John, died about 6 years later. Now, Alfred, that's his father, was 4 years old when they landed. So at 14, he and his mother were then the breadwinners for the family, and they continued to grow vegetables and sell their vegetables at their little shop. And it seems that they actually did well. Oh, in the meantime, Alfred was sent to a little school. It was apparently because he was sort of busy all day with their little enterprise. There was only time at night for schooling, but there was a little private school apparently, Miss Innes's private school in Uitenhage, which he attended from the age of 5. But the enterprise did well enough for Alfred, by the time he was 23, to buy a small farm called Mimosadale, 6 miles from Uitenhage. And that is where AAK was born in 1871. So they landed in 1849, and then AAK was born in 1871. When he was 4, his father managed to buy a slightly bigger farm, Brakfontein. It's now called Rocklands, which is about 12 miles from Uitenhage. But in addition to his farming, obviously Alfred was very entrepreneurial, and he established a transport business where he was transporting goods with teams of oxen and ox wagons from Port Elizabeth to Graaff-Reinet, and even as far as Kimberley. Now, I don't think any of us can actually imagine transporting with an ox wagon from Port Elizabeth to Graaff-Reinet, which was of course walking pace. I mean, that's what it amounted to. So you can imagine how long these journeys took. But it proved to be a good enterprise, because Kingwill remembers that a trip to Graaff-Reinet and back with 6 wagons, each with a team of 16 oxen, earned him £800. Now, to make these numbers more realistic to us today, I've tried to convert them into the value of current rands. And that's not an easy exercise. I actually made use of a bit of artificial intelligence to help me, because in order to do that, it depended on when the transaction took place, because the calculation involves taking the British inflation rate from that date up until 1961, when we changed to rands, and then the South African inflation rate from 1961 to the present, to try and get to a comparative figure. So I readily admit that the numbers may not be absolutely correct, because it is quite a difficult calculation, but a trip with those 6 wagons to Graaff-Reinet and back earned him £800, which is, in today's terms, about 800,000 rand. So you can see that it was nearly the price of a farm by the time he'd done a trip with 6 wagons up to Graaff-Reinet and back, never mind as far as Kimberley. Interestingly enough, these trek oxen on these long journeys developed a condition that they called lung sickness. Now, I'm not sure what the modern terminology would be, but what was interesting was the remedy. they made an incision in the tail of the ox just above the brush and inserted a piece of cloth that was soaked in serum. Now it doesn't say how the serum was made up, but the serum was inserted in order for the serum to be absorbed into the bloodstream of the ox, and so treat this lung sickness. And it was also interesting, and one can understand it, that because of these long journeys, they actually shoed the oxen, like you shoe a horse. Now, how you shoe a cloven-hoofed animal, I've no idea, but they say they actually shoed the oxen. So A.K. was brought up in a house with very strict religious rules. No work on Sundays. His father conducted 2 services on a Sunday. Interesting, the children were not even allowed to look at their toys, never mind even play with them on a Sunday. So as I said, A.K. then attended this little school in Uitenhage. And then when he was 9 years old, his father sold Rockfontein, which he bought after he sold Mimosadale, and moved to the Karoo. He then bought Somerville in the Aberdeen district, which was a farm of about 6,000 morgen. Now, I don't know if some of you may these days we measure in hectares and not in morgen. Morgen is slightly smaller than a hectare, being 100 yards by 100 yards, but a hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters, so there is a difference. And for that he paid about 3,000 British pounds. And once again, a rough calculation makes that, in today's terms, about 3 million. And it was here that his 6 brothers and 3 sisters, who had been born when they were down on the farms near Uitenhage, were then educated or schooled by tutors and governesses on the farm in the Aberdeen district. From the age of 11, he was sent to school in Grafrenet for about 3 years. But at the age of 13 and a half, his father apparently thought that he'd had enough schooling. And so he was then brought back to the farm to be his father's foreman. But at school, he had learned to play the piano, and it would appear that he had a significant musical talent. And so he became the organist for the church services on the farm that his father conducted every Sunday. Now there were 6 brothers. That was Arthur, my grandfather, Pennell, Willie, Graham, Cyril, and Frank. And 3 sisters, Mabel, Edith, and Blanche. Now, interesting that those 6 brothers all ended up farming in this Grafrenet, New Bethesda area. Most of them were actually in the New Bethesda area. But of course, over time, Kingwill, some of them have moved away to other areas and so on. And so there are only, in the New Bethesda area, really only 2 active Kingwill's farming still, which would be Leonard and Charles and his son Justin. Other than those of us who ended up in the Malibu district. Now, during his 11 years that he spent at Somerville, that was the time that he says he really learned to know what farming was all about. He learned to shear. He says he can remember on one occasion shearing 47 Angora goats before lunch. So obviously he became quite an astute shearer. But then he also remembers a very severe drought period between 1880 and 1890. And he said in those days there were no borehouses on the farm, so no windmills and solar pumps and all the things that we know today. There were just 2 wells on the farm. And they had to get all the water from these 2 wells in buckets with ropes. Now, I don't know if you can imagine watering the stock on a 6,000 Morgan farm by drawing buckets of water out of a well. You can well understand that he says their hands were so hard eventually from pulling on these ropes to get the water out of the well to water the animals. So it was no easy task, and so buying a farm in the Karoo in 1880 was not a very good introduction to the difficulties of farming in the Karoo. At a point his father bought an expensive imported Angora ram from what they in those days called Asia Minor, which probably was what we would call today Turkey. So it was one of AAA's tasks that every morning the Angora kids had to be taken out of the kraal at 8 o'clock in the morning and put out to graze, and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon they had to be collected and brought back into the kraal again. But he says that in those days watches were very expensive. So he didn't have a watch. But he was innovative enough to make himself a sundial so that he could tell what the time was, so that he could bring the kids back into the kraal at the right time. He also remembers very large numbers of vultures in the 1880s. In fact, he says that he remembers one occasion when 3 cattle were killed by lightning, and the next morning there were only bones left. The vultures had cleaned it up altogether. And he made the interesting comment that he thought that that fact was the reason why the blowfly problem was nowhere near as bad in those days, because there was never any rotten meat lying around in the veld, because the vultures consumed it all, so there wasn't breeding ground for blowflies. Then in 1890, his father sold Somerville and he bought Hout Constant. I think most of you know where Hout Constant is, on the road to Maysburg from here. And he continued to be his father's foreman, and at that stage he was earning, once again in today's rand terms, about 6,000 rand a month. They farmed on Hout Constant with 2,500 sheep, 80 dairy short-horn cows, 60 brood mares, a large number of pigs, and then in addition, of course, Port Constant has significant areas of lands, and so they were cultivating and growing crops on the lands as well. So while he was at Hope Constant, he met a girl that he thought he would like to marry. So he duly sat down and wrote a letter to this girl proposing marriage. Now, as was the practice, the letter was put into a little leather bag and it was hung up on the gate post at the main road. So when the postman came past, he picked up the leather bag and the letter was then added to the post that he was carrying, and in that way the letter gets to its destination. Well, on this particular day, somebody else came along before the postman, saw this leather bag, and he had to do some repairs to his saddle and he needed some strips of leather. And so he thought that this leather bag would serve him well to get some leather strips to repair his saddle. And so the leather bag was pinched. So of course the leather, at least the letter, never reached its destination. But AAK was very pragmatic, and he decided that the fact that the leather bag had been stolen was a sign to him that that was not the girl he was supposed to marry. So it was only quite some years later, when he returned from the Transvaal to farm at St. Olives. Now I'll come back to the Transvaal issue in a moment. But at the age of 25, he married a Miss Letitia Paxton from Pretoria. So that obviously the romance had started while he was farming in that area, but I'll explain that in a moment. But they had 3 sons. The eldest was William. Now William was always known to everybody as Colonel Bill, and I'm sure some of you can remember him. He was the initiator of the big general dealer shop, Kingwill and Murray, which he managed for many years here in Graaff-Reinet. He served in both world wars. And the second son was Eric, that was my father. The other son was Dennell, that was Trevor Kingwill's father. And then there were 2 daughters, Mavis, who married Bill Walker from Craddock. Bill Walker owned the main shop in Craddock. It was called Cullen Q, and then later he bought Burnside Farms, where he established an Ayrshire stud. And then Marion married a very successful apple farmer in the Elgin district. So that's how we Kingwills are related to the Paxton family. So AAK's first own farming venture was in 1889, when he and his brother Willie hired the farm Mount Pleasant in Aberdeen. I don't know Mount Pleasant, I don't know if any of you do, but in addition to their sheep farming, he and Willie, his brother, became experts at buying, training and trading in cart horses. Because naturally cart horses at that time were in very strong demand, because that was the mode of transport. I mean, everybody was transported in with cotton horses. But then in 1893, their lease on Mount Pleasant terminated. And their father, Alfred, then said to AAK that he thought that there were good opportunities for young men up in the Transvaal, and that he and Willie should consider moving to the Transvaal and trying to establish themselves there. So by that stage they owned 1,500 merino sheep, which they leased out to another farmer, and they then travelled by cotton horses to Rosmead. Apparently there was a railway line from Rosmead onwards, but there was the railway line from Grafenet had not yet been built. So the nearest point that they could get on a train was at Rosmead, and then they trained to Pretoria. But their equipment had to go by wagon, and so their equipment took 3 months to reach them in Pretoria. When they got to Pretoria, AAK managed to acquire for himself cotton horses, and he started travelling around the area looking for a suitable farming opportunity. And he then settled on a piece of land on the Crocodile River where the town of Brits is today. And there he grew potatoes, oats, wheat, and apparently did quite well. But the interesting part of the story is that when they got the Transvaal Republic, they had to register themselves. And they could choose whether they want to register as burghers or as aliens. But they chose to register as burghers because they thought that they were going to establish themselves there and become part of the Transvaal community. But they didn't realize what the consequences would be of registering as burghers. Anyway, while he was farming there on the Crocodile River, it soon became apparent to the neighbors that he had this musical talent. So whenever anybody was organizing a dance party, AAK was called on to provide the music. And on one occasion, when there was a dance party organized to celebrate New Year's Day, while this party was in progress, a horseman arrived on the scene to announce the news that all the burghers were being called up to fight the English because the Jameson raid was in progress. So then they were landed with a dilemma because they were Englishmen themselves and they had no desire to fight the English. Apparently there was a British consul in Pretoria which AAK consulted, and the consul just said to him, no, there's not going to be a war, just go home and carry on with your life, you know. But fortunately, of course, the Jameson raid failed miserably, and actually before they were required to be involved, the fight was over. But AAK did land up having to do guard duty at President Kruger's house in Pretoria. And so he tells of one incident where he was on guard duty, and he was apparently on the guard duty on the back side of the house. And so the president's son arrived and wanted to go into the house from the back door. But he was faced with AAK's bayonet. So he said to him, but what's this about? You know who I am. So AK said to him, no, when I'm on guard duty, I don't know anybody. And so he was forced to go around to the front door and first get clearance from the guards at the front door before he could go into the house. The piece of ground that he hired on the Crocodile River was a farm known as Roy Koppies. And as I said, they were growing potatoes, and he became involved with the irrigation because it was all done under irrigation from the Crocodile River. So already at that stage there were canals and weirs and to get the water from the Crocodile River onto the various farms, and he became involved as the person who was responsible for keeping the canals open and keeping them working and all that sort of thing. But this whole incident of the call up by the burghers, Willie didn't take to this idea at all. He said no, he'd had enough of the Transvaal. This sort of thing might happen again, and he's going back to the Cape. So Willie then returned to the Cape, and he then bought the farm St. Olives. But AAK stayed on up in the Transvaal because he was doing well there, and he was actually busy organising with a partner, because he realised that the oat hay that they were producing was very cheap during the summer. Naturally, that's when it was being produced. But during the winter, the oat hay was very expensive. And so he was busy organising with a partner to erect facilities for storing the oat hay so that they could buy up the oat hay that was being produced by farmers in the summer, store it up and sell it back to other farmers in the winter, because of course oat hay was great feed for horses. But then unfortunately, soon after Willie came back to St. Olives, he was killed in an accident on the Oberg Pass. He was apparently coming down with a cart and horses, and he collided with an ox wagon that was coming up the pass. And he was thrown out of the cart, and he landed under the wheels of the ox wagon. And so 3 days later, he died from his injuries. And that then made AAK change his plans, because Willie had now bought the farm down here, and so he decided to jack up his farming in the Transvaal and then come back with his bride, and that's why he married somebody from Pretoria, because he was up there at that time. So he was bride when he came back to farm. Now soon after he got back from the Transvaal, the Boer War started. And so he volunteered to be a guide to the British forces in the Midlands, because he knew this whole area very well. So he led numerous columns of British soldiers when particularly there were commandos that were operating, Boer commandos that were operating in the area. And so they were, the Brits were always trying to find where these commandos were to engage with them. And so they did a lot of sort of following up, taking tracks of where the commandos had been active and so on. But he says that after doing that, and particularly on one occasion where where they followed a commando almost all the way to Nelspruit, And then when they actually located them, the British officer didn't have the guts to engage with them. And so AAK said, no, if that's going to be the attitude of the British officers, then he's out of here. And he's going back to his farm. And so then he stopped acting as a guide. Interestingly, when he got back to Graafrenet, he found that the Brits had commandeered 2 of his best cart horses. So, expropriation without compensation. AK had a great love for sport. And it was when he was sent to school in Graafrenet, as I mentioned earlier, that he had learned to play cricket and tennis. And so he and Willie used to practice their cricket on the farm. They had a paraffin tin as wickets, you know, like many youngsters had and so on. And it ended up that AAK played for the Graafrenet first team cricket and tennis until he was 60. Yeah. And then he developed a bad hip. And interestingly enough, both my father and I developed a bad hip around about the age of 60. But anyway, what's amazing is that the Graafrenet cricket team travelled by horse and buggy as far as Willemore to play a cricket match. Can you imagine? And the story is that on the way back from Willemore, when they got near to Aberdeen, there was a river that was in flood. And so they couldn't cross. So they were sitting on the side of the river, waiting for the water to run down so that they could cross. But in the meantime, he says, they were very hungry because this was a long journey that they were, and they'd been banking on getting something to eat in Aberdeen. And then he saw that there was a tall local black man who actually managed to walk through this river with a parcel on his head, just so that it was just his head that was sticking out above the water. So he then got the idea, now wait a minute, there's something that can be done. So he decided he could swim across this river, which he did, bought some food in Aberdeen, and got hold of this black man, and he carried the food on his head across the river so that the other guys could get something to eat. They even travelled to Johnsonville on horseback to play a cricket match. I mean, these things are so easy for us today. I mean, we travelled to Johnsonville in less than an hour, but of course it was quite a different story in those days. And then at the age of 17, he was selected to play for Midlands against the MCC. Can you imagine a Midlands cricket team playing against the MCC? Apparently that's what happened. And he was also an athlete of note because he was the Graafrenet District's 100 yards and 220 yards champion. And then in his later years he took up bowls and played in various tournaments. So sport was a very, very important part of his life. So I think that is the early part of his life, and I'm sure you've listened to me for long enough now, because it was at that stage that he had then become other than his farming at St. Olives, he'd become a very active cattle trader. He was selling large numbers of cattle, particularly currently to the Free State government, who had a cattle buying initiative at that stage. And so it was at that stage that he then bought the English crops. But I think that's the second half of the story, because I'm sure that we much rather now to go and have a cup of tea.